Snow whipped through the dark like a living thing, clawing at the windows of the small cabin on the ridge. Inside, Giselle Morin, 68 and bone-tired, sat by the fire that barely held against the storm. Her hands trembled as she held an old photograph, a girl smiling under summer light, before setting it face down on the table. The wind howled louder, carrying with it a faint sound she almost mistook for her own memory. But it came again, a cry. Weak. Human. Lantern in hand, Giselle pushed open the door, the cold slicing through her thin coat. She trudged through snow up to her knees until she saw something dark near the fence, a young woman, half buried, clutching her swollen belly. Giselle dropped beside her, pressing fingers to her wrist. The pulse was faint. Who was this stranger fate had sent to her door, and why did her face feel so familiar? The first thing Mira felt was warmth. A heavy quilt pressed over her body, the soft crackle of fire nearby, and the faint scent of herbs and wood smoke filled the air. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, but then came the ache in her bones, the sting on her fingers, and the weight of her swollen belly reminding her that this was no dream. Her eyes fluttered open. The room was dimly lit, illuminated by a single lamp that cast a golden pool of light on the walls, which were made of old timber. Every surface looked worn but cared for, jars of dried roots on a shelf, a kettle steaming softly on the stove, and a pair of wool socks hanging by the fire. The world outside howled, wind striking the shutters like angry fists, but inside it was still. From the corner, a voice spoke, low, steady, and roughened by age. "You're awake." Mira turned her head slowly. A woman stood near the stove, her gray hair tied in a loose braid, her frame small but firm. She wore a heavy sweater with frayed cuffs and held a wooden spoon like it were an anchor. "You were half frozen," the woman said. "Another hour out there and you'd have been gone." Mira tried to speak, but her throat was dry. "Where am I?" "North Ridge. My cabin." The woman poured soup into a bowl and brought it over. "Eat slowly." Myra's hands shook as she took the spoon. The warmth hit her lips like sunlight after days of dark. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "Don't cry now," the woman muttered, half kind, half awkward. "You're safe." Mira forced out a whisper. "Why'd you help me?" The woman hesitated, then sat across from her. "Because you were dying. That's reason enough." They said little else that night. The only sounds were the wind and the soft scrape of spoons on bowls. When Mira finished, exhaustion took her again. The next day, sunlight broke weakly through the frost-covered window. Mira tried to stand, but pain caught her side. She winced and sank back into the quilt. The woman was by the door, putting on thick boots. "You should rest," she said without looking back. "I can help." "You can barely sit." Mira lowered her eyes. Shame burned through her. "I'm not useless." The woman paused, then softened. "Didn't say you were. My name's Giselle." "Mira," she replied quietly. Giselle gave a small nod. "Well, Mira, you'll stay until you can walk again. After that, we'll see." When the door closed behind her, Mira looked around the cabin. Everything spoke of years lived in silence, shelves neatly arranged, a rocking chair worn smooth by habit, a faded photograph of a smiling girl beside the hearth. Mira reached out, tracing the glass lightly, wondering who she was. That evening, Giselle returned with wood and a small bag of supplies. She worked in silence until Mira finally spoke. "I was trying to reach Silver Creek," Mira said softly. "They said there might be work at the inn. That's a long way for someone in your condition." "I didn't have a choice." The father's gone. The people I worked for, they told me to leave when I started showing. Giselle looked up, her eyes unreadable. People can be cruel when they think they're decent. Mira managed a sad laugh. You're not like them. I was once. Mira waited, but Giselle didn't explain. She simply went back to stoking the fire, the flames catching in her gray hair like traces of old sunlight. Days turned into weeks. The snow outside softened, but winter's hold remained. Mira grew stronger, though her steps were slow and her nights restless. She helped where she could, sweeping floors, chopping vegetables, mending a torn curtain. Giselle, though often distant, began teaching her things. How to make salves from herbs, how to tell when the wind meant snow or rain, how to keep a fire steady through the night. She moved with quiet precision, each task done as if she'd done it 1,000 times. At night, the two women would sit near the fire, sharing small words over tea. Mira spoke of her city life, working long shifts, the loneliness of tiny rooms, and the look on her employer's face when he told her she was no longer a fit image for the front desk. I walked for 2 days before the storm caught me, Mira said one night. Didn't think I'd make it past the ridge. You almost didn't, Giselle replied. What were you doing out there that late? Giselle's gaze lingered on the fire. Listening. For what? For nothing. That's all there ever is out here. Mira studied her quietly. Beneath the woman's calm, there was something unsettled, an ache she carried like a hidden wound. That night, Mira woke to a sound, a soft voice murmuring from across the room. Giselle sat by the window, rocking slowly, whispering words that didn't make sense at first. Mira strained to hear. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, my girl. Giselle's shoulders trembled. Her hand clutched the photograph from the mantel. The name Brielle was written faintly on the back. Mira turned away, pretending to sleep. The next morning she said nothing, but the image stayed with her, the woman's face wet with tears, whispering to someone who wasn't there. The days that followed grew softer between them. Giselle began to smile more, even if faintly. Myra's hands steadied, her color returned, and she started humming while she worked. Once, when she dropped a bowl and it shattered, she apologized over and over. Giselle only sighed, kneeling to pick up the pieces beside her. Don't fret. Things break, she said gently. Sometimes they can be fixed. Sometimes they can't. But there's always another way to use what's left. Mira nodded, the words sinking deeper than they seemed meant to. As the month turned, their routines became a quiet rhythm. Morning chores, shared meals, long silences that no longer felt empty. Giselle even began showing her how to knit. The cabin, once silent, now carried small signs of life. A pot bubbling, laughter rising awkwardly, the creak of the rocking chair as the fire burned late into the night. Still, sometimes Mira caught the older woman staring at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not quite sadness, not quite fear. Giselle never explained it, and Mira never asked. Yet deep down, both women knew that fate had tied them together for a reason neither fully understood. Weeks slid quietly by, measured in firewood stacked against the wall and the slow growth of Myra's belly. The world outside the cabin thawed only a little. Icicles still clung to the eaves, but patches of earth began to show beneath the melting snow. Inside, warmth had returned to both the air and the hearts of the two women who shared it. Mira could move freely again. She swept the floors, peeled potatoes, and laughed at the way Giselle grumbled whenever she hummed too loudly. Yet beneath their routine, something deeper stirred, an unspoken awareness that the cabin was both a shelter and a shadow. Giselle had turned it into a place of survival, but it carried memories that still breathed through the walls. At times, the house felt like a womb, safe, quiet, full of life waiting to begin. Other times, it felt like a tomb, holding grief that refused to rest. One late evening, as Mira folded a small bundle of washed clothes, she heard Giselle humming by the fire. The tune was soft and broken, repeating the same few notes. Mira froze, recognizing something in the melody. It carried the ache of a lullaby meant for someone long gone. "You have a lovely voice," Mira said gently, smiling over her shoulder. Giselle stopped immediately. "Didn't realize I was humming." "It's comforting," Mira replied. "Did you sing that to someone?" A pause. Then, quietly, "Once." Mira waited, but the older woman only stirred the fire and said nothing more. The flames popped, filling the silence between them with sparks. That night, the wind returned, low and heavy. Mira couldn't sleep. Every creak in the wood felt like a whisper. When she rose to drink water, she saw Giselle by the window, her face faintly lit by the dim glow of the lamp. The widow's lips moved soundlessly at first. Then, in a fragile whisper, words slipped out. "I'm sorry, Brielle. I'm so sorry, my girl." Mira froze. The name lingered in the air like smoke. Giselle's shoulders shook, her hand gripping the window frame as if steadying herself against memory. Mira backed away silently, heart tight. She lay awake the rest of the night, listening to the quiet sobs fade into stillness. The next morning, Giselle was her usual self again, quiet, steady, avoiding eye contact. She moved through the kitchen like nothing had happened. "Sleep well?" she asked, setting a cup of tea before Mira. "Yes," Mira lied. They ate in silence. Only the clinking of spoons filled the air. When Giselle stepped outside to fetch wood, Myra's eyes drifted toward the mantel. The photograph she'd seen before caught her attention again. It showed a young girl, 17, maybe 18, with dark hair that curled slightly at her shoulders and eyes bright with mischief. She wore a white summer dress, sunlight spilling across her face. There was something painfully alive about that smile. Beneath the frame, in faded ink, a single name was written: Brielle Morin. Myra's breath caught. When Giselle returned, she noticed immediately where Myra's gaze had gone. Her body stiffened. "She's beautiful," Mira said softly. Giselle's jaw tightened. "Put it down." "I didn't touch it." "Don't ask about her," the older woman said, her voice flat but trembling at the edges. "I wasn't. Please." The word came out almost as a plea. "Don't ask about her." Mira nodded, startled by the sudden sharpness. Giselle turned away, staring out the window, her back rigid. The moment stretched long and heavy, like the pause before a door shuts for good. The rest of the day passed in quiet distance. Giselle busied herself with chores that didn't need doing. Mira stayed near the hearth, pretending to read. The air between them felt colder than the wind outside. That night, Mira took out her small notebook, the only belonging she had kept through the storm. The pages were wrinkled, the ink faded from her journey, but it had become her way of keeping sane. She wrote slowly, her handwriting shaky under the candlelight. She said not to ask about the girl. But the way she looked at me when she saw the photo, it wasn't anger. It was fear. Like I'd opened a door she'd spent years keeping shut. The name was Brielle. The same name she whispered in her sleep. The same voice that broke when she said sorry. Whoever Brielle was, she still lives here, in every silence, in every look Giselle tries to hide. Mira closed the book and pressed it to her chest. For the first time since arriving, She felt the cabin's stillness not as comfort, but as weight. The warmth from the fire couldn't chase away the chill that came with secrets left unspoken. The days that followed moved carefully, like walking over thin ice. Giselle spoke less, often slipping outside to stand alone beneath the trees. Sometimes, when Mira joined her, she'd find the older woman staring into the valley below, where the snow still clung to the pines. "You look like you're waiting for something," Mira said once, trying to sound light. Giselle's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "Maybe I am. For what? Forgiveness, perhaps." The words were simple, but they hung between them, heavy with meaning. Mira wanted to ask who she needed forgiveness from, but she already knew the answer. In the evenings, when the fire glowed low, Mira began noticing small things. The way Giselle's hand lingered on the rocking chair before sitting, how her eyes softened whenever Mira laughed, how she'd sometimes stop mid-sentence when Myra's tone reminded her of someone else. The air was thick with something unspoken, not quite love, not quite sorrow. It was as if Giselle saw two people at once when she looked at her: the young stranger she'd rescued, and the ghost of her daughter, long lost to time. For Mira, the feeling was both comforting and unsettling. The woman who had saved her life was kind, but haunted, offering warmth with one hand and holding back pain with the other. One evening, as the last light faded, Giselle dozed in her chair. Mira watched her chest rise and fall, the lines of age softened by sleep. She thought of how many winters this woman had spent alone, how much weight a single heart could carry before breaking. When the fire crackled, Giselle stirred, half awake. "You remind me of someone," she murmured. Mira smiled faintly. "Your daughter." Giselle's eyes opened. For a second, there was a flash of something raw: love, guilt, maybe both. "Go to bed, child," she said quietly. Mira obeyed, but sleep did not come. The wind whispered through the cracks, carrying the faint echo of that name again. Brielle. It filled the small cabin like a prayer left unanswered. The snow began to melt at last. Streams of water trickled from the roof, and the sharp scent of thawed earth crept through the air. Mira stepped outside with a shawl around her shoulders, breathing in the faint promise of spring. The mountains still wore their white crowns, but the path behind the cabin had begun to show patches of brown and green. She moved carefully, her belly heavy now, her steps slower than before. Giselle had gone into the village that morning to trade herbs, leaving her alone for the first time in weeks. It felt strange. The silence was deeper without the sound of the old woman humming under her breath. Mira gathered a few branches from the woodpile, but one loose plank on the porch caught her foot. When she bent to fix it, her hand brushed something hollow underneath. She frowned, tapping the spot. The sound was too deep to be the ground beneath it. Curiosity stirred. She pried the plank up gently and found a small wooden compartment hidden below the boards. Inside sat a sealed chest, its brass latch dull with age. Dust clung to its corners like cobwebs that had never been disturbed. Mira hesitated. She wasn't the kind to pry into another's pain, but the way Giselle avoided certain topics had left too many questions floating in her mind. This chest felt like an answer waiting to breathe. She carried it inside, setting it carefully on the table. It was heavy, the kind of heavy that didn't come just from weight, but from years. By the time Giselle returned, her cheeks flushed from the cold, Mira was sitting near the fire, the chest resting between them. "What's that?" Giselle asked, her voice sharp. "It was under the porch," Mira said softly. "The plank was loose." Giselle's gaze locked on the box. The color drained from her face, her breath catching. For a long time, she didn't move. "Put it back," she whispered. "Giselle." Please. Her hands trembled as she sank into the chair across from Mira. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled quietly, filling the silence with its rhythm. Finally, Giselle's eyes lifted, tired, defeated. I suppose it doesn't matter anymore. She reached for the latch with shaking fingers and opened the chest. Inside were bundles wrapped in faded cloth. She unrolled the first and revealed a tiny knitted bonnet, yellowed with age. Another held a small wooden rattle. At the bottom, a stack of letters tied with a string, their edges worn. Beneath them lay a set of metal instruments, clean, precise, wrapped carefully in linen. Mira recognized them instantly. Medical tools, she said softly. Giselle nodded, her throat tight. I was a nurse once. A midwife. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. These hands brought children into the world. I was proud of that. Until I couldn't save the one that mattered most. She paused, her eyes distant, as though seeing a room far away in time. My daughter, Brielle. She was 17 when she told me she was expecting. I remember how she stood in the kitchen, shaking, terrified. I was furious, not because she was in trouble, but because I thought she'd ruined our family's name. Her father had already passed by then. I was alone, afraid of the neighbors' gossip, afraid of shame. She clasped her hands together, the bones in her fingers trembling. So I sent her away. Told her my sister would take her in until it was over. I said we'd fix it quietly, start fresh. She cried the whole way to the train station. I didn't hug her goodbye. I thought I was being strong. Her voice broke. She died a month later, giving birth. Alone. They said she bled too long before anyone found her. Myra's breath caught. Giselle reached into the chest again, pulling out one of the unopened letters. The paper was brittle. She unfolded it slowly. She wrote me from the home she was staying in. Said she was scared. Said she wished I'd come. I didn't read it until after she was gone. Her tears fell silently, darkening the paper. I burned everything. My nurse's license, my uniforms. I couldn't bear the sight of another newborn. I left the town, built this cabin, and stayed here. People thought I wanted peace. Truth is, I wanted punishment. The room went still except for the faint drip of melting snow outside. Mira felt something inside her shift. Not pity, but recognition. The old woman's grief was like a mirror turned toward her own fears. Being alone, being unloved, being forgotten. You've carried that alone all these years, Mira said quietly. I deserve to, Giselle replied. I let her die. I didn't even bury her myself. Mira leaned forward, her eyes soft. You can't change what happened, Giselle. But you can help me live. The older woman looked up, her face wet with tears. You think I deserve that? I think she'd want you to. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked again, as if breaking the silence for them. Giselle reached across the table and took Myra's hand. Her grip was fragile but steady. Forgive me if I see her when I look at you, she whispered. I don't mind, Mira said. Maybe I was meant to come here. Giselle smiled faintly through her tears. Maybe we both were. That night, the chest remained open beside the hearth. Giselle didn't put it away this time. She left the tiny clothes folded neatly on the table, the letters spread like offerings. When she finally slept, her breathing was calm, the first peaceful sleep Mira had seen her have since arriving. In the morning, Mira found her sitting by the fire again, holding the small yellow bonnet in her hands. "She'd have been 35 this year," Giselle said quietly. Mira placed a hand on her shoulder. "She's still with you. In this house, in your heart, in every kindness you give." Giselle nodded, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "I used to think this place was my punishment. Maybe it's my second chance." Outside, the snow melted in slow rivers down the hillside, carrying winter away. Inside, two women sat in silence, one forgiving, one forgiven, their hearts stitched together by loss and something gentler that was beginning to grow in its place. By the time the last of the snow vanished from the ridge, the mountain had changed. The air was softer, the soil damp with life returning. Streams ran freely again, threading through the trees like silver veins. For the first time in months, sunlight found its way into the cabin, falling across the wooden floorboards in long, gentle bands. Inside, the rhythm of life had changed too. The fire no longer burned out of necessity but comfort. Mira spent her mornings knitting tiny clothes from leftover yarn while Giselle sat across from her, reading from one of her old journals. "They're silly stories," Giselle would say with a half-smile. "Little things I used to write about my husband. The trips we never took, the garden he always promised he'd grow." Mira would listen, her hands moving steadily with the needles. "He sounds kind," she said once. "He was," Giselle replied, her eyes distant. "Kind and patient. I wasn't either of those things for a long time." The afternoons were warmer now. They often sat outside on the small porch, drinking tea from chipped mugs, watching the world wake up again. For the first time since the storm, laughter began to visit the cabin, soft and uncertain at first, then real enough to echo off the trees. It startled Giselle the first time it happened, that she could laugh again. She caught herself mid-smile, shaking her head. "What?" Mira asked, still laughing at something trivial. "It's been a long time since this house heard laughter," Giselle admitted. "Then we'll make sure it keeps hearing it," Mira replied, her tone light but sincere. By late April, the road into the village was clear enough for travel. One morning, Giselle decided to walk down. She hadn't been there in years, but something inside her urged her to go. When she returned, she carried a bag of flour, sugar, and a handful of stories. The shopkeeper's son had taken over the general store. The baker's wife had recognized her instantly and insisted she take a loaf for free. "They thought I'd left for good," Giselle said, setting the bag down. "Didn't expect to see me walking through the square with a smile." Mira grinned. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Let them think what they want." But she did notice the way people's eyes followed her, the curiosity, the whispers. Some had seen the young pregnant woman living in her house and drawn their own conclusions. By the time Giselle returned the second time, the whispers had grown into quiet gossip. "Old Morin's granddaughter, that's what they say," she told Mira with a chuckle. Mira laughed too. "Do you correct them?" "No," Giselle said, stirring the soup. "Why spoil a good story?" There was no shame in her voice, only warmth. For the first time in years, the sound of her name in town didn't carry pity or judgment. Carried respect, even admiration. As the days lengthened, the two women settled into something that felt almost like family. Giselle no longer hovered over Mira like a nurse, but moved around her as if they shared one heartbeat between them. She'd sit near the fire in the evenings, darning socks or mending a torn curtain, while Mira hummed lullabies she barely remembered from childhood. Sometimes they talked about the future. Mira dreamed aloud of raising her child in peace, maybe finding work nearby. Giselle always smiled at that, never saying too much, but inside she knew she didn't want Mira to leave. The cabin felt alive again because of her. Because of the laughter, the soft footsteps, the smell of stew simmering in the pot. On a quiet evening in early May, they sat together watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. The light turned the snowmelt into rivers of gold, and the wind carried the scent of pine and wet soil. Mira was sewing a tiny blanket when she stopped suddenly, her eyes widening. "What is it?" Giselle asked, worried. Mira reached for her hand and guided it to her belly. "There," she whispered. "Do you feel that?" A small, gentle kick pressed against Giselle's palm. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Giselle let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "Oh, my sweet girl," she murmured, her voice trembling. "That's life. That's a heartbeat saying it wants to stay." Myra's eyes filled with tears. "She's saying hello." Giselle nodded, her hand still resting there. "Or maybe she's reminding us that not all stories end in sorrow." They stayed like that for a while, two women joined by touch, by memory, by something sacred that needed no words. After the moment passed, they sat in silence, the world around them slowing to a gentle stillness. But when the wind shifted, Giselle's gaze turned toward the horizon. Dark clouds had begun gathering far off in the distance, rolling over the mountains like a bruise spreading across the sky. "Storm's coming again," she said softly, almost to herself. Mira followed her eyes. "You think it'll be bad?" Giselle gave a half-smile. "The mountain never lets go easy. But we'll be ready this time." She rose and went inside, checking the shutters, adding more wood to the pile. Mira watched her, this woman who had once lived only in guilt now moving with purpose again, protecting not just a home but a life that wasn't hers to lose this time. That night, as rain began to patter softly against the roof, Giselle found herself writing again. She opened a new notebook and began to fill the first page. If forgiveness has a face, it is quiet and patient. It doesn't come with words, but with small acts, a meal shared, a hand held, a child's heartbeat under your palm. Maybe this is how redemption feels. Not loud, not sudden, but steady. Like a candle that refuses to die, no matter how long the night has been. She paused, smiled faintly, and glanced toward the sleeping figure on the couch. Mira, resting with one hand on her belly. The storm rumbled faintly outside, but it didn't sound cruel this time. It sounded like change, the kind that tears the old world down only to let something gentler take its place. And for the first time in many years, Giselle felt ready for whatever the mountain would bring. The wind began to shift late that afternoon. It wasn't loud at first, only a low hum in the distance, the kind that makes animals restless and sets the trees trembling before the sky even darkens. Giselle noticed it while collecting firewood, her hands stiff from the cold. She looked up at the clouds rolling over the ridge. They were thick and heavy, swallowing the light as they moved. By nightfall, the wind had turned cruel again. Snow whipped against the windows with the same force that had once nearly claimed Myra's life. Giselle bolted the shutters and added wood to the fire, hoping the storm would pass as quickly as it came. But just before midnight, Mira woke with a sharp cry that tore through the cabin. Giselle rushed to her side. Myra's face was pale, her hands gripping the quilt. "It hurts," she gasped. "It's too early." The old woman's heart clenched. "How far apart?" "I don't know, a few minutes, maybe less." Another wave of pain hit, stronger this time. Giselle pressed her hand to Myra's belly. The child was restless, turning, ready but too soon. Panic clawed at her chest. She had seen this before, years ago, the same fear in her daughter's eyes. "Breathe through it," she whispered, though her own breathing had gone shallow. Outside, the storm roared louder, drowning out everything else. The roads were already gone under drifts of snow. No doctor could reach them now. Giselle moved quickly. Her hands shook as she lit every lantern in the cabin, filling the small space with trembling light. She boiled water, laid clean sheets on the bed, and gathered the tools she'd once buried under guilt. Myra's cries echoed against the wooden walls. "Please don't leave me," she sobbed. Giselle turned, tears blurring her vision. "I won't. Not again." She washed her hands with trembling precision, whispering short prayers between each movement. The memory of another night, another storm, pressed down on her. Her daughter's last letter had described pains like these. She had ignored it, telling herself help would find its way. It never had. She couldn't fail again. "Hold on, sweetheart," she said, voice shaking but firm. "You and that baby are staying with me." Mira nodded weakly, clutching the sheets. Sweat glistened on her forehead despite the cold air. The storm howled harder, the windows rattling as if trying to break in. Giselle drew the curtains and focused on the task before her. She checked Myra's pulse, her breathing, the child's movement. The signs were familiar. Too familiar. "It's coming too fast," she murmured to herself. "What?" Mira gasped. "Don't you worry. I've done this before." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Inside her chest, her heart pounded with fear and a strange kind of defiance. This wasn't just labor, it was history repeating itself, testing her one last time. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the shutters, followed by the roll of thunder. The lamps flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the room. Giselle wiped Myra's brow and murmured softly, "You're not alone. I'm right here." When another contraction hit, Mira screamed, her voice breaking. Giselle held her hand through it, squeezing tight, grounding her. "You can do this," Giselle whispered. "Breathe. I know it hurts, but you're stronger than you think." "I can't," Mira choked out. "Yes, you can. You must." Her words were more than encouragement. They were a command to fate itself. She refused to let the mountain take another child, another mother, another chance for grace. The hours dragged like years. The cabin's warmth fought against the cold pressing at the windows, but Giselle's focus never broke. Every sound of the wind was matched by Myra's breathing, every flash of lightning by her cries. At one point, Giselle looked up and whispered to no one in particular, "If you're watching, my girl, help me now. Show me how to save her." Her tears fell freely, but she didn't stop working. She adjusted the sheets, refilled the kettle, counted Myra's breaths. Her movements grew steady, the same sure rhythm she'd once known as a midwife. Finally, Mira clutched her arm. "It's coming, Giselle. I can feel it." The old woman nodded. "Good girl. We'll bring her into this world together." Thunder boomed so close it shook the cabin. Giselle steadied the lanterns, her voice rising above the storm. "Keep breathing. Don't be afraid. You're not alone." "I can't see straight," Mira cried. "You don't have to. Just listen to me." The old woman's face was lined with tears and determination. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was the moment. The air grew thick with urgency, not fear, but life itself demanding to be let in. "Push," Giselle said softly, her hand guiding. "You're almost there." Outside, the storm reached its peak, the wind roaring like an ocean breaking against the mountain. But inside the small cabin, two hearts worked in rhythm. one fighting to give life, the other fighting to protect it. Mira screamed again, gripping the quilt until her knuckles whitened. Giselle held her steady, whispering over and over, "You can do this. You can do this. I'm here." Another contraction came, stronger than the last. The world outside disappeared into sound and light. When the pain subsided, Mira collapsed back against the pillows, panting. "Please, tell me it's almost over." Giselle brushed her hair from her face. "Almost, child. Almost. One more push and she'll be here." Mira nodded weakly, tears mixing with sweat. "Don't let go." "I won't," Giselle said again, her voice breaking. "I promise, I won't ever let go." The fire burned low, the shadows dancing across their faces. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something stronger had taken root, the quiet, unyielding will to save a life, no matter what it cost. And as Giselle prepared for the final moment, her fear melted into resolve. She wasn't the same woman who had once turned her back on her daughter's pain. This time, she would stay. This time, no one would die alone. Thunder rolled over the ridge like the mountain itself was waking. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with heat and fear. The lamps flickered as the wind pounded the shutters, every gust rattling the walls like the sky was trying to tear them open. Mira cried out again, her voice raw, body trembling under the strain. Giselle wiped her brow, her old hand surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside and out. "Push, Mira," she urged softly, leaning close. "You're almost there. You're doing so well." Mira shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It hurts too much. I can't." "Yes, you can. Listen to me." Giselle's voice cut through the chaos, firm but gentle. "You're stronger than this storm, you hear? You were made for this." The young woman nodded weakly, gripping Giselle's arm like a lifeline. Her fingernails dug deep, but the old woman didn't flinch. She only whispered, "Breathe, love. In and out. Stay with me." Another wave came, sharp and unforgiving. Mira screamed, the sound blending with the wind outside. The room seemed to pulse with light and shadow, thunder, lightning, fire, pain. And through it all, Giselle moved with quiet purpose. Her body remembered what her heart had tried to forget. The way to calm panic. The way to listen for the rhythm of a child's first fight to live. "Good girl," she murmured as Mira pushed again. "That's it. You're doing it." In flashes, memory bled into the moment. Giselle saw her daughter, Brielle, standing in their old kitchen, crying, clutching a small suitcase. "Please, Mama, don't make me go." The storm outside then had been smaller, just rain against the roof. Yet her words had been sharper than thunder. "You'll stay with your aunt until it's over. It's for your own good." Brielle's eyes had glistened with betrayal. "You said you'd love me no matter what." "I do," Giselle had said, though her voice had shaken. "That's why I'm doing this." But it had been a lie. She wasn't protecting her daughter. She was protecting her name. The memory cracked open like a wound. "Push, Mira," Giselle said now, her voice trembling under the weight of the past. "Don't stop. You're almost there." Lightning flared again, lighting the room like a photograph. Giselle's face drawn with effort, Myra's clenched jaw, the sheen of sweat on both their brows. Between contractions, Mira gasped, tell me she's okay." "She will be," Giselle said. "She has to be." Her hands worked with care and precision, moving in rhythm with Myra's cries. The storm outside began to blend with another sound, The low rumble of water boiling, the soft hiss of the wind slipping through the cracks, the whispered prayers falling from Giselle's lips. When another contraction struck, Mira arched, crying out from a place beyond words. "You're almost through, sweetheart." "Just one more," Giselle said. Myra's breath came in short, ragged bursts. Her whole body trembled. "Look at me," Giselle said, placing a hand on her cheek. "You're not alone, you hear me? I'm right here. Don't let go." Mira looked into her eyes and nodded once. Then she pushed with everything left in her. Another flash from the past struck like lightning. Giselle standing on her porch years ago, the sky pale with morning light, the mailman's face pale and uncertain. "Mrs. Morin," he had said softly, holding out a folded telegram. Her hands had trembled as she opened it. The words had been brief, merciless. "Your daughter, Brielle Morin, deceased. Complications during childbirth." Stop. She had read it again and again, as if reading could change the meaning. Then she had dropped it in the mud and screamed into the dawn until her voice broke. Now, the thunder outside rolled like that same scream, carrying all the years between then and now. "Push!" Giselle cried, voice breaking through the roar. Mira let out a final cry, every muscle straining. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. The lamps flickered, the fire dimmed, even the storm seemed to draw a single breath. Then came the sound, a small, sharp wail. Fragile, furious, alive. Giselle froze. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Mira collapsed back, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Is she?" Giselle's hands moved on instinct, wrapping the newborn in a clean cloth. The baby's tiny limbs flailed weakly, her face red and wrinkled. But she was crying, strong and certain, her voice filling the small cabin with something that sounded like life itself. "It's a girl," Giselle whispered, her voice trembling. "A perfect little girl." She handed the baby to Mira, her eyes never leaving the child's face. Mira cradled her close, sobbing. "She's beautiful. She's perfect." Giselle smiled through tears that blurred everything. "You did it, my dear. You did it." Mira looked up, still crying. "Her name. I want to name her Brielle." The words hit Giselle like a wave. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor beside the bed, laughing and crying at once. "Brielle," she whispered, the name trembling on her lips. "Then she's ours." Mira reached down, placing her free hand over Giselle's. Their fingers intertwined, young and old, past and present, joined by the tiny heartbeat between them. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder rolled farther away, the snow softening into quiet. Inside, the cabin glowed with a light that felt new, clean, forgiven. Giselle sat there for a long time, watching the baby breathe. Every sound of her small lungs, every flutter of her fingers, felt like a second chance that had taken a lifetime to arrive. When Mira finally drifted into sleep, Giselle stayed awake, holding the child close. She traced a fingertip over the baby's cheek and whispered, "You brought her back to me." The wind outside slowed to a whisper. Inside, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in decades, the house felt alive again, not haunted by loss, but blessed by what it had returned. The mountain thawed slowly, as if reluctant to let go of its hold on winter. Streams of melted snow traced new paths down the slopes, and the thick walls of white that had trapped the cabin for months finally softened into mud and wild grass. Inside, warmth had returned, not just from the fire, but from the rhythm of new life. Baby Brielle's quiet coos filled the small room where silence once lived. Mira spent her mornings by the window, nursing her child while sunlight spread gently across the floorboards. Giselle sat nearby, rocking in her old chair, humming lullabies she hadn't dared to sing in decades. "You know," she whispered to the baby one afternoon, "your mama's stronger than any storm that's ever touched this mountain." The baby blinked, her small hand curling around Giselle's finger. The old woman smiled, tears rising without warning. "You're going to change her life, just like she changed mine." Mira overheard, her heart swelling with gratitude she couldn't name. "You talk to her like she understands you," she said softly. Giselle looked up, eyes twinkling with warmth. "She does. Babies always do. They carry pieces of the ones who came before." Days passed in gentle routine. Mira regained her strength, moving with new confidence as she cared for her daughter. Giselle, though slower now, found purpose in every task: tending the fire, mending clothes, making tea that filled the room with herbs and hope. One morning, a knock echoed through the cabin, the first in years. Giselle froze mid-step, her old fears creeping back, but Mira touched her arm. "I'll get it." When the door opened, a young man stood on the porch, his coat dripping with melted snow. Behind him, two women carried baskets of bread and wool blankets. "We heard about the baby," the man said shyly. "Thought we'd bring a few things." Giselle blinked, too stunned to speak. It had been so long since anyone from the village had come up the ridge willingly. Mira smiled, ushering them in. The visitors placed their baskets by the fire, their eyes softening as they saw the baby. "She's beautiful," one of the women whispered. "Looks just like you, miss." "She looks like herself," Mira said gently, though she couldn't help glancing toward Giselle, whose face had softened into quiet awe. The visits became frequent after that. At first, curiosity drove them, people eager to see the reclusive widow who had taken in a stranger and her child. But soon, compassion replaced gossip. They brought food, supplies, and laughter. Some stayed to help shovel paths, others just to sit by the fire and hold the baby while Mira rested. For Giselle, each visit chipped away at the wall she'd built around herself for years. The whispers of shame that had once followed her through the village no longer held power. The story had changed. She was no longer the widow who hid her past, but the woman who opened her home when no one else would. One quiet evening, after everyone had gone, Mira found her sitting on the porch, watching the last of the snow melt from the trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. "You've changed," Mira said softly, handing her a cup of tea. Giselle smiled faintly. "I suppose I have. Or maybe I just stopped hiding." Mira sat beside her. "You could have kept your story buried forever. But you told it anyway, to all of them. That's brave." Giselle shook her head slowly. "No, my dear. It wasn't bravery. It was finally telling the truth. All these years, I carried my daughter's ghost like a punishment. I thought silence was atonement. But silence is just another kind of death." She looked toward the horizon, where streaks of gold touched the fading sky. "Now, I want something different for this house. I want it to give back what I couldn't." The next morning, Giselle walked to the village for the first time in over 20 years. Her legs ached, her breath came shallow, but she didn't turn back. She met with the local clerk, hands trembling as she signed the papers. When she returned home that afternoon, Mira was rocking the baby by the fire. "I've done something," Giselle said, voice quiet but certain. Mira looked up, concerned. "What is it?" Giselle placed a folded envelope on the table. "It's the deed. The cabin's no longer mine." Mira frowned, shaking her head. "Giselle, you can't." I can, she said firmly. And I have. Myra's eyes filled with tears as she opened the envelope and saw the names. Mira Alvarado and Brielle Alvarado written in careful ink. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you do this? Giselle smiled softly. Because I want this house to live on. I want it to be more than my shame. Let it be a refuge for any mother who finds herself lost, cold, or alone. No one should ever be turned away here. Mira wiped at her tears. You're giving me your whole life. No, Giselle said, touching her hand. I'm giving you what's left of it, so it can become something better. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling between them. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, and Mira rose to pick her up. She turned back to Giselle, voice trembling. I promise. No one who knocks on this door will ever be turned away. Giselle nodded, eyes shining. That's all I needed to hear. As night fell, the two women stood by the window, watching as fog curled gently over the thawing land. Life had returned, slow, steady, unstoppable. Mira laid the baby in Giselle's arms. She loves you, you know. Giselle smiled, gazing down at the child's peaceful face. She's my second chance. You both are. Outside, the stars broke through the mist, clear and bright. Inside, the old cabin stood warm and alive again. No longer a place of grief, but a promise kept. A full year had passed since the storm that changed everything. The mountain, once buried in white, now shimmered with green. Wildflowers pushed through the thawed soil, and the sound of the river carried through the trees again. Soft, steady, alive. The cabin stood just as it always had, though now it seemed brighter somehow. The walls that had once held silence now echoed with laughter. Mira stood on the porch, her hair loose in the summer breeze, watching as little Brielle tottered across the worn wooden planks, arms stretched wide for balance. Careful, sweetheart, she called gently, smiling through tears. Slow down. The baby giggled, stumbled once, and found her footing again, her first real steps. Mira clapped her hands, overcome with pride. That's my brave girl. Inside, Giselle sat by the fire, a light blanket over her knees. Age had etched deeper lines into her face, but there was peace in her eyes now, the kind that only comes after years of carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. She watched through the open door as the sunlight spilled across the floor, touching the rocking chair, the cradle, the framed photo on the mantel. Brielle Morin, 17, forever smiling. Giselle hummed softly under her breath. It was the same lullaby she had sung to her daughter long ago, the same one she had hummed through the storm the night this new Brielle came into the world. Her voice cracked at the edges, but it carried a warmth that filled the cabin. Mira came in, lifting her daughter into her arms. She did it, she said proudly. She took her first steps. Giselle's eyes glistened. I knew she would. She's been ready for days. The baby wriggled in her mother's arms, reaching for the older woman. Giselle opened her hands, laughing softly as the child climbed into her lap. There now, she whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You'll walk far, my little one. Farther than any of us ever did. Mira knelt beside them, resting her head against Giselle's knee. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. You gave us everything. Giselle shook her head. No, my dear. You gave me something I thought I'd lost, the chance to love without fear. The baby grabbed the edge of Giselle's shawl, tugging playfully. Giselle laughed, brushing a finger over her cheek. You know, she said after a pause, I used to think forgiveness was something you prayed for in silence, that one day it would just appear, like a light through the clouds. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the summer breeze carried the scent of pine and lilac. But I was wrong. Forgiveness doesn't come as a prayer. It comes as a knock on the door in the middle of winter, when you least expect it, when you're certain the world has forgotten you. Her words hung in the air, soft and certain, as if the house itself were listening. After a moment, Giselle reached for something resting on the mantel, a small, hand-carved wooden heart, polished smooth by age. She turned it over in her hand, tracing the single word carved into its surface: hope. "I made this for my daughter when she was little," she said, her voice gentle. "But she never got the chance to see it. I think it's time someone else carried it now." She placed it in the baby's tiny hands. The child cooed, turning it over curiously before pressing it against her chest. Myra's eyes filled with tears. "She'll treasure it," she said softly. Giselle smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I wanted." The baby nestled against her shoulder, the wooden heart clutched close. For a long moment, the three of them sat there, generations of love bound together not by blood, but by grace. Outside, the day began to fade into golden light. The trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering in the wind. The cabin, once a refuge for one broken soul, now stood as a home for many hearts. Mira rose and walked to the door, looking out at the horizon. She could see the path leading down toward the village, the same path that had once been buried under snow. Now it glowed with the promise of life. She turned back to Giselle, who was still rocking softly with the baby in her arms. The firelight flickered across her face, casting her in warmth and memory. "Do you think she'll remember you?" Mira asked quietly. Giselle smiled. "I think she already does." As the evening settled, the sound of laughter drifted up from the valley. Children playing, someone chopping wood, a dog barking in the distance. Life, ordinary and beautiful, carried on. Inside, Giselle's eyes began to close, her hand resting lightly on the baby's back. Mira watched her with quiet tenderness. The old woman's breathing slowed, peaceful and steady, as if she were listening to a song only she could hear. The camera would linger on the small wooden heart, resting against the child's chest. The word hope gleamed softly in the fading light. The fire crackled once more, then settled into a steady glow. Outside, the mountains stretched toward the sky, green and alive, a place reborn. For years, she thought the world had forgotten her. But sometimes, forgiveness doesn't arrive as a prayer. It comes as a knock on the door in the middle of winter. The camera pans outward, the cabin small against the vast mountain landscape, smoke curling gently from the chimney, the sound of a baby's laughter echoing faintly through the trees. Would you have opened your door that night? Tell us what you think in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more powerful, true-to-life stories like this one.